Hey everyone, it's Ben Hardy here, and in today's video, we're reviewing this modified Toyota 4Runner Venture, and I would say that this is probably the most common type of build that I see in 4Runners, and I'm going to talk about the upsides and the downsides of building out your 4Runner like this in today's video. Before we get into this, big shout out and thank you to the Doug Smith Dodge Ram Jeep Chrysler here in American Fork for giving me some time with this used 4Runner. I'll include a link to their website in the description down below. If you have any questions, just ask for Brad. Also include a link to my car buying guide. Let's get into it. So first off, let's quickly go over the engine. 4-liter V6 naturally aspirated, goes through a 5-speed, puts out 270 horsepower and then 278 pound-feet of torque. And then this one has the ARB air compressor added under the hood. Pretty common setup for off-road / overland builds. Before I move forward with this review, I do want to mention if you want to see more videos just like this, then I recommend you subscribe because I post content every single day. Now, some other modifications you probably noticed with the headlights here. Yeah, this is pretty common for me to see on these 4Runners. People just want something a little bit different than stock. And then we've got this aftermarket setup. So it's not like a full bumper, but it does allow you to add a winch. You can see it kind of changes the front bash area, but you still have the Tier D skid plate underneath, it looks like. There at the, or actually no, that's aftermarket. It looks kind of like a Tier D skid plate, but yeah, so it kind of changes this whole front end. Super aggressive approach angle in general with this setup, but it kind of built into the bumper. And again, this is something that I see is pretty common instead of doing like a full bumper swap with the 4Runner, because it'd be kind of difficult with how high this goes. Now, our tire wheel setup on this is 275 by 70 by 17 in the front and over in the rear, which, by the way, you can definitely fit this setup, this tire and wheel setup, on a stock 4Runner in terms of the wheel sizing and then the tire sizing. But you'll notice that we've got upgraded suspension with this one, and I'll show you guys the setup in the rear as well. And then you guys can see the step / rock rails. We also have the roof rack here at the top. It's a good look in terms of the stance, but my guess is these wheels definitely have more, they're not a negative offset, but they pop out more than the stock wheels. So my assumption is they put the wheels out, and then pushing the wheels out made it so there's probably some rubbing with this tire size, so then you got to lift it a little bit. It's kind of like a never-ending game, and I'll kind of talk about this more while driving. But really cool setup from the side, and then I love the taillights here, these aftermarket ones. Again, I don't know the long-term reliability of these taillights, but the sequential definitely looks cool. And then you can see the badges are all blacked out. And then as for the interior, there's not really much to go over. This is basically just a normal 4Runner interior, so you can see got the soft touch here. You've got Tier D there on the headrest. Got the nice Softex seats. You can see we do have this added in for the light bar and everything, and the air compressor. So nice little setup there on the dash, pretty simplistic. And then of course you got 4-wheel drive with this, and then the Venture did come with crawl control, rear locking differential, 8-track and all that. The Venture is basically a Tier D off-road, but just a little bit different. But anyways, this is still going in the mid-40s. These 5th gen 4Runners are so expensive. But let's take this out and see how it drives with the slight modifications. Then let's talk about lifting a 4Runner, modifying a 4Runner, my kind of thoughts. And this will also, I guess, apply to the Land Cruiser as well, since I own a Land Cruiser. I haven't lifted mine. I'll explain all of it. Let us venture in the 4Runner Venture. I remember reviewing the Venture package when it was brand new. It's pretty interesting. And yeah, this setup definitely takes a little bit more muscle with the power steering. It's not the tires, it's the lift. And it does make a bit of noise. I don't know what the life was like of this 4Runner. It's got 24,000 miles, but I'm assuming this was definitely taken off-road, which again, that's what this car's meant to do. But aftermarket components plus off-roading, you usually are gonna get some noises. Again, I sold cars for 3 years. I've reviewed a bunch of used cars, and I have never once reviewed a modified vehicle that does not do something weird. Doesn't sound like there's always something weird. So, and I'll kind of fully touch base on that more so towards the end. But anyways, we'll talk about how this drives first and foremost. I will say, every single time I drive a 4Runner, I kind of want to buy one, even though I own a Land Cruiser. There's just something charming about how these 5th gen 4Runners drive and feel. Like it's a bit, it's almost the same size as the Land Cruiser, but it's just a little bit smaller. It's lighter weight, and it's not quite as like big inside either. So I don't know, it just kind of has it's kind of like a cozy feel. Like the Land Cruiser, like I feel like I have to look back a million miles to see the rear window, whereas this, I don't know, everything's just a little bit closer. But let me tell you, compared to the Land Cruiser, this thing is so brutally slow. It is, yeah, and you guys will see that in just a moment. But something else to note is the 4Runner interiors. I've reviewed quite a few of these 4Runners with some mileage. They hold up pretty well. The only downside is some things like the door can kind of start to get some creaking noises. Not while you're driving, but like opening and closing can be kind of iffy. So some of that stuff, but it's not the worst. I mean, I know plenty of people that have hundreds of thousands of miles on their 4Runner, and again, not everything is sounding the best, but the car still drives perfectly fine. So let's see if it makes a noise going over this. Yeah, so you can hear this. You can hear kind of the front end suspension's making some noise. Now I know some people are going to claim, oh well, if you did, you know, like a common setup on these is Bilstein's, and I will say that Bilstein makes some really good shocks, but it's mostly the lift. It's the lifting that kind of, it doesn't mess things up, but it changes things enough with the suspension. Whenever you go away from stock suspension geometry, it wreaks havoc in a way. Yeah, the front end doesn't have that same pillowy feel that you get with stock. It's a little bit firmer. Now in terms of the acceleration with this, again, yeah, 5-speed plus sub 300 horsepower V6. It's not a rocket ship, but again, it's got character. I kind of like it. But yeah, you definitely have to get into it a lot. Like in my 200 series Land Cruiser, it's rare that you go above 2,000 RPMs. It's just cruising. So, I mean, this actually doesn't drive too bad. It's a little bit more vague than a stock 4Runner. Like the front end, it's kind of a little bit more wallowy, but not bad, not bad. Lifted 4Runners, I think most of them are pointless. Now, I have seen some builds that have been done really, really well, where people basically turn their 4Runner into like a rock crawler. But something to note is they don't just lift the car a little bit and then call it a day. What you, excuse me, what you typically see with those 4Runner builds is they're extremely expensive. And I mean, like, we're talking, people are spending 20 grand on just parts alone, plus labor, and it ends up being 50. I mean, it's crazy how much these 4Runner builds are sometimes. Like, people will take a $50,000 4Runner and throw another 50 grand into it. It does drive really well, I will give it that. But then at that point, it's like, man, you might as well just buy like a Bronco Raptor or something crazy if you're gonna go all out like that. But the point I'm trying to make is, outside of those expensive builds, what most of these lifted 4Runners end up doing is, in my opinion, run the suspension. So you lift the suspension up. So what that means is that the vehicle is not going to have as much down travel anymore, if that makes sense. So like the wheels can still get tucked up, but then going down, right, because you've lifted it, they can't go as far down because they haven't changed the, and I'm horrible at explaining this stuff. Almost need someone that with an engineering degree to do a better job than I can. But I understand the basics with it. And so what you feel on road is, it feels kind of like the car's on stilts now. And then off-road, what happens when you get really articulated, the car can no longer reach down because it's already extended in the downward direction because of the lift with the tires and the wheels. And so it actually runs the capability. What it ends up doing, in my experience, is a stock vehicle will reach down and it'll be able to continue to get grip. It'll touch the ground. Whereas a lot of these lifted vehicles, they kind of teeter-totter side to side more, and then they can't touch the ground as often. And so then what you end up getting is less grip. Now, obviously you gain ground clearance. But I think that ground clearance is very overrated. It's what everyone talks about with off-roading, like how much ground clearance does the car have? I have taken pretty much every single vehicle off-road that you can buy, and what I've discovered is if a vehicle has at least 9 inches of ground clearance, it is more than enough for most off-roading. And if a vehicle has, I would say, 10.5 inches of ground clearance plus, it's overkill for a lot of stuff. Now I understand there's like off-roading that you definitely need that much ground clearance, especially like crazy rock crawling. But again, the off-roading that most people do, you just don't need it. And especially if you're going to give up down travel for clearance, it's almost like a losing equation. And again, this setup is like, I think, a pretty good example, because on a stock 4Runner, if you keep the tire offset, so if you just took like a 4Runner TRD Pro and you kept the stock wheels, you could put 275 by 70 by 17 easily. No lift, no suspension mods whatsoever. It would fit it perfectly fine. And so that's what this has. And so if the lift was to fit the bigger tires, it's kind of pointless. And then if the lift was to make this more capable off-road because it increases ground clearance, yes, it does technically have a little bit more ground clearance, but it's also kind of pointless because now the down travel is less. And so now you don't get as much. Like, I guarantee if you took this off-road and took a stock Venture just with some all-terrain tires, the stock Venture would be able to get further because it's going to have more movement. It's going to be able to touch the ground more often. And so, yeah, long way to say that I think this build looks really cool, but I think that people should really, really consider modifying, especially lifting their vehicles, especially these vehicles with independent suspension, either in just the front, or, you know, a lot of modern vehicles now have independent rear suspension as well, because it doesn't necessarily make it more capable. In a lot of cases, it actually makes it less capable, and you might be able to fit a little bit more tire, you might be able to get a little bit more clearance, but you're giving up a lot with that. And that's why I still, like, all my vehicles are in stock suspension, and I have not encountered a single off-road situation where I feel like I need to have a lift. And I do, like, rock crawl, I do all of it. What I'll say is, when you don't have as much ground clearance, like with my Land Cruisers where they're only about 9 inches, that's what skid plates and rock rails are for. You use them, which, yeah, it can be kind of painful, but that's kind of what they're meant for. So let me know what you guys think about this build. Let me know what you guys think about lifted modern vehicles in general. I think for the most part, unless you're willing to spend crazy money, it's probably not worth it. And so it's one of those things where it's like, you either keep it stock and just buy some new tires like what I do, or you spend $50,000 and you get really good dialed in suspension, but then you just spent $50,000. So yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know. That's all.